Right, corruption remains a global challenge faced by many countries across the world, from money laundering, illicit trading to diversion of public funds and properties. With more and more repeated happenings, it has propelled the need to establish the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption to eradicate corruption in both the private and public sector. This is an institution that was adopted by the Second Ordinary Session of the Assembly of the African Union in 2003 to create appropriate strategies to combat corruption while introducing open investigations against it. 20 years after, how many countries have been able to enforce and implement policies against it? More importantly, has Nigeria been able to reduce the scourge of corruption in the country? Joining us via Zoom is the former director, Africa Network for Environment and Economic Justice, ANEJ, and an anti-corruption expert, David Okolo. Good morning. Thank you for joining us on TVC Breakfast. Reverend, can you hear me? Good morning.
Yes, good morning.
Right.
Morning, Reverend.
Now,
how are you, ma'am?
Well, fine.
Very well, thank you. Let's begin with how far we have come 20 years after with the fight against corruption. Have we been able to adopt framework or come up with framework that can address this matter, this scourge that we know is an international scourge?
Yes, in the context of Nigeria, I will say we have at least achieved some level of legislative framework and putting institutions in place, and then ensuring that there's a community of practice within Nigeria. And then if you also look to other African countries who have also tried as much as possible to put institutions in place, you can also point to South Africa, point to Kenya, and they have also put institutions in place, and in Ethiopia as well too. I will say that at least with the coming up of the convention, it has also empowered quite a number of countries in Africa, in line with the commitment they have also reached in February 2020, when they came up with a common African position on asset recovery, which is called CAPA.
All right, as it is now, when it comes to the effectiveness of those institutional framework that you talk about, if we spotlight what the EFCC is doing and ICPC are doing, of course, one would say there are prosecution here and there, but it hasn't been able to deter corruption in the way that Nigerians expect. In the last administration, of course, there were a lot of fight against corruption, but there were still reports of humongous corruption allegation here and there. Unfortunately, when allegation comes up, even if it is true or factual, we all have to wait for the court to declare that this thing was a corrupt situation before it is actually a corrupt situation, because there are issues here and there. But in the perception, since we use the word perception, from your assessment, how effective have the institutions being, the EFCC, the ICPC, and all the other institutions that are meant to curb the corruption?
Thank you, my brother. Because of the level of high level of awareness, we have number of social media platforms in the country. There's real-time information dissemination across the country. 20 years ago, the source of information was streamlined. You either hear the news from NTA or few national newspapers. But as we speak, every village now have their newspaper. Every community now have their radio. When I mean radio, you can easily pull to YouTube and begin to broadcast. And the level of social media platforms has also empowered individuals across the country to disseminate information without any one streamlined regulation across the country. What that means is that in real time, people now get information about corruption. So if you compare this to 20, 30 years ago, it's not the same thing. Well, what am I trying to say here is that the impact of anti-corruption agency will easily not be fed because of the perception, because of the real-time information people are receiving. But if you also look into their peer groups in terms of comparing EFCC and ICPC with anti-corruption agency in other countries, you will see that EFCC and ICPC have also done very well. But are there opportunity for them to improve on what they are currently doing? Yes, there is opportunity.
When you talk about perception, it means we are not getting something right with making people believe that something is being done at addressing matters of corruption. Talk to us what it is exactly that is missing.
Now, you see, in the anti-corruption study, it's difficult to actually have, but researchers are trying to now move beyond perception in measuring corruption. But the most famous measuring corruption indices is the perception, which the Transparency International is using, which we call Corruption Perception Index, the CPI, which is released by Transparency International annually. And now the reason, obviously, is that, it's difficult to actually measure corruption. And so what they do, they use perception. What do the businessmen feel about the corrupt state? And what do important individuals across the country, what do they feel? And so when they look those perceptions, they use it in measuring. But the question is that, does that actually really reflect the actual corruption state? That's another issue to discuss. But the real challenge is that as we speak today, CPI remains one of the famous tools being used globally to measure corruption. And that has not put Nigeria in a good light. And that is why you see that generally there is this perception that the situation in Nigeria is calling for more focus. And if you look the actual state of things in Nigeria, prior before now, the level of grand corruption in the country is unexplainable, because first, the massive corruption in the public sector, particularly when you see the cases that EFCC and ICPCs are taking to court, you will think that this is like a drama, but it's real. But and that for us is something that Nigerians need to reflect on. Now, the question is, taking these cases to court, has it helped to address the corruption issue? The more cases are taken to court, the more we see cases of corruption coming up. I think the real issue is impunity. If you look the number of cases that EFCC is taking to court and the number that they are winning, it brings out clearly that the prosecution process is weak, and that really gives loophole. And I'm happy that EFCC and ICPC are beginning to reflect on how they prosecute their cases in the court. And when the politically exposed persons, very powerful politicians in the country, are not prosecuted, it helps to increase these negative perceptions in the country. And that's why the culture of impunity is sustained. And then it now undermines our perception internationally, and also undermines the potential for foreign direct investment to come into the country. And there is a correlation with the status of your country on corruption and the level of inflow of foreign direct investment. And this has really impacted negatively in Nigeria. And so where do we go from here? It's beginning to look into policies and legislative framework. And that's why, as the AU celebrates 20 years of their convention on preventions and combating corruption, which Nigeria is a signatory to, is an opportunity for us to begin to reflect on how to move the country forward. One real key area that I think all the countries in Africa are focusing on is the issue of asset restitution. And if you look the framework that African Union has put in place in addressing this problem, which is CAPA, Common African Position on Asset Recovery, you look the 4 pillars that they are focusing on. And one of the first one is detecting and investigating assets. And then when you look that pillar, the level of capacity within the country to actually assess those pillars is also something we have to look into by putting in comprehensive whistleblower protection through legislations and practice. Do we have that in the country today? We don't. Strengthening the role and ensuring resources and autonomy for detention bodies such as Financial Intelligence Unit, which we have in the country. Enhance the transparency around public pay, because once the pay is increased, that will help. Then under Pillar 2, under CAPA, we also have the recovery and return of assets to develop a comprehensive and measurable and efficient asset recovery strategy. If legal reforms are put in place, like in the case of Nigeria now, we have put in place the POCA, which is the Proceed of Crime Act. That has helped to strengthen the asset recovery architecture in the country. And that has empowered the anti-corruption agency to put in place asset recovery unit. EFCC have done that very well, and ICPC have done that very well. I don't know of any other anti-corruption agency if they have actually put that in place. But at least we now have in place a kind of asset recovery architecture in the country. We have to commend the last National Assembly, and the president was able to sign it into law. And that, for me, is something that we must commend the previous government for putting in place that law. And that law empowers the anti-corruption agencies to move forward, particularly on the issue of asset recovery. If you look the amount of illicit financial flow out of the country, Nigeria is one of the countries that is paying a huge price for that, because of a high level of corruption, because of illicit financial flow moving out of the country. So for you to address that problem using the AU framework, the CAPA, as a starting point, I think we must begin to look at how we manage those recovered assets so that we send a right signal to the international community. And for me, that's what Nigerians have done with Abacha 2, Abacha 3, Abacha 4, Abacha 5. Particularly putting in place framework to ensure that once these resources is returned back to the country, they are used judiciously. How Nigeria has fared in that realm is something that we all have seen that Nigeria have done very well in terms of returned asset, using it to build major infrastructures across the country, and using it to also support the poorest of the poorest in the country, which our organization monitor in previous administration. For me, these are something we can continue to refer to. But the more you achieve some of these results, the more corruption is happening because of the real-time reporting on some of the corruption cases. For me, that is something that we should be happy about, because media is playing a major role, including TVC and others, real-time reporting of corruption cases across the country, put more pressures on the anti-corruption agencies to be more effective and efficient in how they go about tackling particularly grand corruptions that have impacted negatively on the development of the country.
Talking about the Abacha loot, I believe you've been following the development where a court is saying that the government needs to make known up to about $5 billion how monies were, disbursed, and the details of how all of that went. I wonder what you make of that, because Nigerians are saying that, of course, the government had the resources or whatever it took to make Nigerians understand when those monies were returned, the conditional cash transfers, and how monies were disbursed to a lot of people, the poorest of the poor, and so on. That since the former Minister of Humanitarian Affairs said that they had data, they had a list of everyone the monies were disbursed to, that should be made known to Nigerians. I wonder what you make of this.
Yes, I think we're in a democracy, and every Nigerian citizens and institutions do have responsibility to hold the government accountable. And for me, it's something that we should welcome. And it's up to the government now to respond, because first, what the government have done in the case of Abacha 2 was to enter into an MOU with civil society in Nigeria to monitor the return of the Abacha 2, which is the $325.5 million. And we understand very clearly that the government, again, have also entered into agreement with another organization in Abacha 3 to monitor the use of the return of the $311 million that was used for building infrastructures across the country. So if there is a call for government to disclose, it's up to the government to use those reports to explain to the public. And we have also, in our own case, in the Abacha 2, put in our website on how the government spent the $325.5 million. We just concluded the final monitoring across the country, about 15 states that is remaining. We did a spot check just to confirm what the government said that they have disclosed and spent in terms of cash transfer for the poor of the poorest. What we are currently doing now, we are trying to firm up the offshore the money that was released from central bank compared to the money that was disbursed downstream. That means the money that was given to the very poor people across the country. You know, sometimes, and this is really a big problem in Nigeria, you know, people sometimes, I see people come to the television to say things they don't have information on. They don't take the time to just do a little research to at least see if the information is out there. The fact that you are not aware, which is part of your ignorance, you should not use that to undermine the system. So there are a number of people who come to the television to say, we don't know what Abacha money was spent for. They don't just take the time to do a little research. For instance, in the Abacha code that was spent in the country for cash transfer program, I think people should make effort to do a little investigation. You will find out that this money was actually disbursed to the poorest of the poor. Yes.
David Igolo, we have to leave this conversation here because we have run out of time, unfortunately. But we must thank you for your time on the program. Anti-corruption expert speaking with us there.